Welcome back, everybody. We're going to, let me just map out the rest of the conference. We're going to have Beverley's presentation with presumably time for some questions and answers for Beverley, and then we'll go right into the panel discussion at, let's see, 4:45, and we'll continue until 5:15. And that will be at the end of our program. Okay, then let me proceed. Beverley Zabriskie is a Jungian analyst in New York City, founding faculty member and former president of JPA, past president of the National Association for the Advancement of Psychoanalysis, past vice president of the Philemon Foundation, which produced Jung's Red Book and other unpublished volumes, or previously unpublished volumes, current associate editor of the London Journal of Analytical Psychology, and an executive member of the Helix Center. Beverley has written on psychic energy and synchronicity, time and Tao in synchronicity, and much, much more. Today, she will address how what Jung called psychoid emerges in clinical practice. Please welcome Beverley Zabriskie.
And thank you all so much for being with us today. I hope you found this as rich as I have, and thank you for sticking with us until now, especially when in New York, at least, it's so beautiful outside. Here's what I'm going to try to do, I'm hoping to do. I'm first going to give 3 quotes. Then I'm going to talk about the felt experience of synchronicity in an individual life. I'm going to say a few things about time, which I hope we can pick up again in the roundtable. I'm then going to talk about a very specific kind of mind matter correspondence between mind and body specifically. And all of these are from the perspective of a Jungian analyst in a consulting room with patients, who I hereby thank for offering me the insights that one can arrive with one's analysands. And then I'm going to complete it with going back to what started Jung's interest in synchronicity. So we're going to go a little bit around, and I hope there's some sense to be made from all this. So the 3 quotes, one has to do with psychic time or reflective time, one with emotionally charged time, and one with chronological time. The emotionally charged being qualitative and the specific chronological time being quantitative, suggesting we live in all those different kinds of time. So the first is from the Red Book. The gifts of darkness are full of riddles. The way is open to whomever can continue in spite of the riddles. Submit to the riddles and the thoroughly incomprehensible. There are dizzying bridges over eternally deep abyss. But follow the riddles, how much future the depths carry. Are not the threads spun down there over millennia? Protect the riddles, bear them in your heart, warm them, be pregnant with them, then you carry the future. The second quote is from William Shakespeare. Time travels in diverse paces with diverse persons. I'll tell you who time ambles withal, who time trots withal, who time gallops withal, and who he stands still withal. And that, as I said, is Shakespeare from As You Like It. And the third is, there's no question that there is an unseen world. The problem is how far it is from Midtown and how late it is open. From Woody Allen, Without Feathers. Chronological time. So synchronous perceptions, convergences between the mental and the material, emerge on a felt spectrum of mind and matter. Unforeseen links between, say, a dream, a fantasy, a physical symptom, and an image which emerges from the unconscious, an encounter with embodied events mirrored in unsought links, often first evoke surprise, startle, even awe, as a disturbance, a perturbation of the usual and expected. These meetings can disorient as if emerging from a new center, or at a different edge between known and familiar, unknown and unexpected, personal time and out of time. When mind and matter meet, riddles are posed to be dismissed or pursued. Viewed as a Jungian psychological phenomena, these convergences are an invitation, a portal for entering a specific moment in space, a meeting point between mind and out of mind, interior and yet alien, and in between in the micro world of an individual and the macro world of interconnecting forces and interactive dynamics. Noting and reflecting, it is as if a wormhole opens between the micro of the individual and a macro or meta world. This brings us into many sorts of time, the chronological time of the conscious, the qualitative time of kairos, emotional moments filled until it reaches a pleroma. And yet, all of these times are liminal. To pursue them may be essential existentially, given that surprise is one of the most basic of survival emotions. Follow the surprises, which, like riddles, take us to new dimensions and domains. From Jung's perspective, synchronous happenings may become synchronicities only when and if psyche slows down to enter, explore, penetrate, ponder, and reflect. With insight, when insight is gained from the question of why rather than how, an intersubjective psyche receives the impact of a convergence or a correlation. In these, we do not find meaning, we make meaning. The inner task of engaging the mysterious is also an emotional experience. And here it is an aspect of Jung's finally seeing the psyche as an effective regulating process. And as an emotional experience, it's more of granting significance to that kind of encounter. So what I'm suggesting is that we, on the one hand, make meaning, and on the other hand, we grant significance, which requires that we feel significant enough ourselves to grant significance. Where we go with these mirroring moments is one of the paths to individuation, a being with self as both object and subject, meeting the other and otherness. Now, the notion of psyche itself plays with time. Mental, emotional, reflective states plunge us into or remove us from or shuttle us back and forth between different locales of mental space-time. Psyche, as a way of knowing in time, is a combination of the flow of outwardly perceived events and an inwardly experienced train of thoughts, feelings, and emotions. That's a quote from Jung. When Jung described time, he drew on wide-ranging analogies, not only from the tales and symbols of the past, but also from the language of the concurrent disciplines in his era. His views of space-time were influenced by the thought experiments of Albert Einstein and quantum physicist Wolfgang Pauli, and they led him to ruminations on abstractions of space-time per se. Jung and Pauli wrestled with the seemingly anomalous crossings of personal, impersonal, inner and outer space-time we call synchronous. But primarily, Jung pursued question of time via what he observed in himself and others about the differences in the felt sense of time, the inner waves of personal emotions, the outer time telling of the chronological world, the body's time, and the progression of aging through the evolving periods of lifetime spent amidst others' lifetimes. As the reflective self gathers one's current substance from all one's previous experience, and in fact impacts it, just as Morgan just described, it allows a center of stillness outside of time and permits the psychological self to be in the ego's individual space-time, but not dependent on it. So while on first impulse, we may posit synchronicity as a privileged sneak preview, a private screening of the freeze frames of reality, whether conceived in the physical world of superstrings or the psyche's complex sorting of experience, the branding of synchronicity often occurs with a time delay of emotionally laden realizations, such as described by Benjamin Libet. In this sense, the realization of the synchronistic is not a prediction, it's a post-diction. So, as a psychic phenomenon, synchronicity emerges in a moment of an inner click, when emotion surges, surprise is registered, and the correspondence between self and any other emerges, even if its origins are not understood. It jolts one out of an encapsulation in ego. One feels as if part of the large story, a network of connections. In the language of the visionary physicist David Bohm, the implicit order is made explicit. Now, I want to talk about various kinds of synchronicities, both observed and involved in. Synchronicity is latent in various manifestations which cross categories and so appear as anomalies. These include correspondence between personal imagery and collective phenomena, multiple manifestations of similar representations within among many persons in unconscious imagery. For instance, different persons produce the same imagery in relatively simultaneous time from the perspective of the observer. Then there are correspondences which emerge when conscious process leads to insights, themes, inquiry, experiment, and theory in the impersonal realm. These occur when similar conclusions are reached among persons who are not in contact. And we often see this in the shared field in time and space, where many scientific and mathematical discoveries, for instance, are reached by more than one mind. Those images, ideas, and perceptions which emerge in relative simultaneously between two persons in close connection, and perhaps even in merger, the kind of soulmate idea is another sort of synchronicity we often see. The emergence of images in both analyst and analysand through their immersion in a mutual affective field. Psychic imagery, which pertains to physical states. Psychic imagery, which appears to prepare an attitude to meet a future event. And psychic imagery, which pertains to the great archetypal phenomena of impending death, anticipated or not. Now, in this last category, we have the experience often of body telling mind what is happening. Our bodies are what's necessary for emotions. They emerge first from body, our body of the sources of our images. So in a depth analysis, there are frequent synchronous communications through transmitted imagery. So I want now to tell you of various synchronistic experiences drawn with permission from analytic practice. And for this, I thank my analysand. And I totally agree with what Morgan said. If there's a phenomenon that happens between me and a patient and it hits something synchronistic in the patient, and also from my own experience, I save that for myself or talking to a colleague about it, and try as much as possible to follow the analyzand's experience. So from the consulting room, often in the analytic field, dream imagery is active even before the patient enters the office and before it is told. Even as an analyst approaches the office door, the analyst may note that an image comes unbidden, as if from body into mind. And sometime later, a patient tells a dream with that precise image. One of the experiences I had of this is a patient was walking toward me, and I thought of a lobster. The image of a lobster actually just emerged. She came in and sat down and said, I just had the strangest experience. I was parked on Canal Street, and it was as if a lobster came out of the gutter from the canal underneath the street and was right next to my car where it was parked. So I didn't think, in Midtown Manhattan, I would have an image of a lobster that was relevant to an analyzand, but that's one of the more fun ones. Like the vibration oscillations of energy fields, the shared imagery of two perceiving bodies and reflecting minds were more easily noted and registered, at least by the analyst at first, and then by both, in an intensified analytic field. The coincidence becomes a synchronicity only when analyst and analysand each separately use the event as sort of reaching and being able to reflect back on oneself as if from a third perspective. It may or might not have immediate relevance for the analytic relationship. Now, in another instance, in the course of a week or even a day, many patients will dream of the same image. It may have a different valence for each. It is the analyst's task then to determine its sense for the energy field of the practice. There may be days when several people, let's say, have an image of a waterfall, which is one of Jung's main images that appear also in Mysterium. And there's imagery among several individuals which pertain to collective events. In an absolutely stunning experience of this, in the spring of 2001, I noticed and started to track the appearance of blackbirds in patient material and creative work. This persisted through the summer. Blackbirds clustered in patients' dreams, painting and poetry. I have written in another place that they seemed bearers of bad news, compelling and suspicious, ebony shadows of the white doves of Aphrodite or the Holy Ghost. They were also the birds of a nursery rhyme, oddly applicable to the New York City of September 2011. The king was in his counting house, counting out his money. The queen was in the parlor, eating bread and honey. The maid was in the garden, hanging out the clothes, when along came a blackbird and pecked off her nose. Sightings of these dark birds in these phenomena were compelling, confusing, uneasy, and ominous. When the World Trade Center was attacked that September and burning bodies were seen flying through the air, blackbird birds fell over Manhattan and the surrounding waters. In the months after September 11th, I heard from colleagues and friends of their bird experiences and dreams. I heard from art teachers that school children were painting blackbirds after the event. To understand this better, I watched a documentary on ravens. These all contributed to a synchronistic or field phenomenon that is also relevant as an analyst, listens to words and is imprinted by facial expressions and body language of the analysand. One often becomes aware of an image which later is communicated in the patient's verbal description of a dream or communication of how they felt after these incredibly shocking phenomena. And now I want to say a few things about body. And I'm actually going to treat dreams about body by the dreamer, which is experienced by the mind almost as if it's from an alien place. Because, you know, ever since the Cartesian formula, there has been a tendency to experience our bodies almost as if they're aliens to us. And Jung has incredible passages about that, about how our bodies are 90% mysteries to us. Now, in the foundational story of psychoanalysis, orthodox psychoanalysis, Oedipus had 3 meetings, one with an unrecognized father, one with an unknown mother, and one with the Sphinx, a fantastical creature with a woman's head, lion's body, serpent's tail, and eagle wings, who asked a question the Sphinx learned from the Muses. What being with only one voice has sometimes 2 feet, sometimes 3, sometimes 4, and is weakest when it has the most? Oedipus replied, man, because he crawls on all 4s as an infant, stands firmly on his 2 feet in his youth, and leans upon a staff in his old age. Part fantasy and part nature, the Sphinx evokes musing. An incarnated being crawls, walks, hobbles, fashions chimeras, can make canes and staffs, and gives voice to the human experience through sound and language. The question presumes that a human is a being capable of self-contemplation and so can find a place in one's universe. In other words, it also suggests that to be human is to have a voice, to express human existence. I'm not able today to go into the particular arm in neuroscience, which has to do with emotions research, and how through that track of neuroscience, the body is being brought back in. So in Jungian process, the mental making of meaning and the emotional capacity to grant significance allows a holistic approach, which includes mind, psyche, and body. It allows, in fact, it insists also, however, that in our daily quotidian life, we make it to Midtown before closures and deadlines. As therapoids, the Greek word, the servers and carriers of psyche, we aim to engage both physical and psychic humanity as we move through reactions to responses, to fate, from fate to destiny, exercise choices, and find agency insofar as we are able. I just want to, as an aside, mention Martha Nussbaum, the contemporary philosopher, who says that these questions of choice and agency often don't apply in very impoverished conditions, that there isn't that privilege. And also, I think the primary reaction we are all having to the battles in Ukraine are the incredible immediate loss of agency that these victims of this war are going through. It makes us almost feel guilty that we have choices. Now, knowing the answer did not save Oedipus from living the phases of his life. Knowledge and consciousness, talking and understanding do not avert us from the progressions and consequences of the mortal life, but alertness to what Jung called the psychoid, the spectrum of felt and considered experience, where the physical and the psychic meet, offers points of reflection on which to lean as a staff as we proceed in both our lives and practices as creatures of body and psyche, often with an emotionally charged recognition of underlying links between mind and matter, dream and event, personal reality, and the other within and without. Contemporary neuroscience views of the monistic mind-body continuum is akin to Jung's implicit knowing of the psychoid as synthesis of mind-body consciousness. The analytic question, which is not the neuroscience question, they ask what, we ask why, for what end, for what purpose. An individual or a group notes a causal convergence that impacts as more than just coincidence. Jung suggests that dreams are both responsive to the present and, as Morgan said, oriented toward a telos. I now want to describe a very specific genre of imagery encountered in material which seems to mirror bodily states and somatic process, including illness and death. While not prophetic, such dreams may be preparing the psyche for what is to come, although the dreamer may not know the relevance of an emerging attitude. I want to stress that Jung talks about the unconscious not predicting the future, but working on the attitudes we're going to meet in the future. This is what he arrived at in an article of all things published in Good Housekeeping in May 1961, 1 month before his death. And that became his essay in Man and His Symbols. Jung once remarked, every word of wisdom is the truth of the instincts. It simply reveals the image which is buried behind the instinct. Instinct is the dynamic side of the images. On the other hand, he also described images as the instinct's perception of itself. In my practice, I've been exposed to an especially moving and shaking genre of unconscious imagery that, as I mentioned, are in dreams of patients who are dealing knowingly or unknowingly with injury, disease, and death. There are often dreams of going beyond the crossroads into a land of gray fog, or going into the surf and the waves and not returning. Now, when therapists engage with patients' illnesses and terminal states, we must differentiate between the ego-body and the psyche-body relationship. With obvious exceptions, the ego cannot be held responsible for an unforeseen illness, while the psyche does have many ways of responding. So a few images and examples. One older woman had a dream that she then drew as an image and showed me. It was of herself and an older woman looking at a monk with a huge clock face. It was a standing clock, showing her on this large clock the hands of the clock moving toward midnight. Now, she was not a particularly religious person, but when she was later diagnosed with lung cancer, I really took that as staying very close to having a religious attitude toward what she was going through. This was particularly important because she had grown up in the Dust Bowl in that era when there was very little help in terms of any kind of emotional or even chemical support. She had, after she suffered sexual abuse, the only medication available to her in that time and place was nicotine. Her smoking habit was formed in an attempt to treat her depression and anxiety of trauma and post-traumatic stress. This was very important to keep in mind when the image of the monk, when she began to blame herself as the person who had inflicted this cancer on herself. And her capacity to forgive herself and also to understand that was the only option she had to try to treat her depression allowed her to move through that bitterness and have a more peaceful death. And as perhaps my favorite quote of Jung's is, the alternatives between bitterness and wisdom are the fateful alternatives in life. So that was very important. It was also important because in that era, it was thought that the ego, if the ego really faced the illness would dissolve. And many people ended up blaming themselves that they could not dissolve their illness. In the interactions of body and psyche in the intrapsychic domain of conscious and unconscious knowing, the dream is often a mediating third. Jung noted archetypal images that do not in any sense represent things as they are in themselves, but rather noted the forms in which they might be perceived and conceived. Some time ago, this is a long time ago, a celibate brother in a religious order came into treatment. Then 55, he had not spoken to a woman other than his mother since he entered the order at 16 years old. I was the first woman he'd been in a room with. I was terribly impressed at the rapid openness with which he revealed himself. It seemed to just come out in a rush, almost as if he was using the analysis as a confessional, not of sins committed, but of his experience. After just a few months, on a Tuesday before Christmas, he dreamt, "I hear an explosion in the attic of my house. I rush to the telephone to call for help. But as I pick up the receiver, I look into a mirror. On the other side of the glass, a woman sits surrounded by a circle of 12 men. She beckons to me. Transfixed, I hang up before the call goes through. I step into the mirror to join her. She says, 'By June, you will be dead.'" Now, this was 4 days before Christmas, and it was 4 months until June. No, it wasn't 4 months till June. I take that back. On hearing this dream, I recalled Jean Cocteau's film scene of Orpheus entering the underworld through a mirror. 4 days after his dream, during his annual family visit at Christmas, this man had a cerebral hemorrhage, an explosion in the attic of body. He died with his head in his mother's lap. By Juno, the archaic great mother figure, he was dead. I felt such gratitude that the dream in that period of time between the session and his death was somehow already informing him and guiding him toward that moment. And I also want to mention how incredibly helpful it is to have some knowledge of some of these mythological themes, and I'm going to be mentioning more of them. Sometimes a dream contains an image of healing. I have written elsewhere of an analysis of an elder man with hepatitis B, which had eaten at his liver, almost like a Promethean image, which then developed a tumor. As he prepared for medical treatment, he dreamt, "I am sitting in my analyst's office alone. A majestic woman comes through the door, not the door to the waiting room, but its twin door, the back door, which led to the back hall, unknown and unseen. As she enters, she lifts her skirts, revealing her private parts. I'm astounded, perplexed, and amazed." The figure of the female revealing herself is in many cultures a typical ritual gesture, an act of regeneration and restoration at times of need, grief and crisis, and hope for a new season. On the Nile, as spring approached, women would be on the boat facing each shore, and there'd be women on the shore. And as the boat passed, the women in the boat and the women on the shore would all raise their skirts to reveal themselves and ask nature to come with generativity and fertility. In one myth, the crone Baubo shows her genitals to make the mourning Demeter, in grief for her lost daughter Persephone, laugh. The Egyptian goddess Hathor, who personified the energy which conceives, creates, brings forth, rears, encourages, maintains, gives birth, and celebrates, plays a similar part in her quintessential myth. In that myth, when the old sun god Ra was sulkily retreating from his battles, as mother to her father, Hathor came and bared her private parts. Ra, roused to laughter, arose and went forth again. The physical implications of the dream and the figure became apparent when the patient, after such intense chemotherapy, he was kept in the hospital throughout, received his medical report. We were both kind of astonished at this figure appearing. Chemotherapy had killed the tumor, which was hanging from the bottom of his liver. Complete necrosis of the tumor was the result. But the effects of hepatic disease blocked the flow of blood through the liver toward the heart. So the waste products were not being processed. This man's life was preserved because, quote, this was in the report, his peri-umbilical collateral vessels reawakened and blood started to pass through the umbilical system. In other words, the dormant umbilical system from his time in the womb of the mother were reactivated from the pressure of his blood, which then bypassed the diseased liver. Jung says the image is the instincts of the image is the instinct's perception of itself. This man's dream announced the presence of regenerative, life-giving process before the MRI recorded it. How am I doing on time?
Let's see, we've got probably, we'll go for another few minutes and then we'll have half an hour.
In dreams, the body is often depicted as a powerful instinctive animal. Before a serious heart illness and subsequent suffering, Jung had a dream in which his illness and recovery were suggested through the image of an undomesticated beast. The primeval boar, a gigantic mythological beast, has finally been hunted down and killed. This is Jung's dream. It has been skinned, the head cut off, the body is divided lengthwise like a slaughtered pig, the two halves only just hanging together at the neck. We are occupied with the task of bringing the huge mass of meat to our tribe. The task is difficult. Once the meat fell into a roaring torrent and swept it into the sea. We had to fetch it back again. Finally, we reached the tribe. A great ritual feast is going to be celebrated. Jung did recover from that illness and lived many productive lives. Finally, we reached the tribe. We have to bring it back to the tribe. I'm suggesting that all of this knowledge of synchronicity is what Jung brings to us as the tribe. So the body is the locus of individuality and personal definition, the source of emotion, imagery, and also empathy. The body is also the common ground we share with all humans, as well as our means of relationship and communication. Our bodies link us to all other sentient beings in our own time and era, and to all who have ever been embodied. They provide us with the vehicle through which the psyche expresses itself as we crawl, walk, and limp through the many phases of incarnated lives and give voice to the experience of being human. If I have another moment, I can tell another.
Yes.
In the autumn of 1913, Jung, then an eminent psychiatrist in the prime of life, family, and love and work, was assaulted by a series of frightening internal images: floods, frozen seas, a sea of blood. He feared these horrific scenes mapped the disintegration of his own psychic ground and signaled the impending chaos of deluge, possibly psychosis, in his internal landscape. Then, at the outbreak of World War I in August of 1914, he perceived his frightful visions as a precognition of the rivers of blood which would drown European battlefields. Today, we would say that in his own midlife upheaval and with the depth psychologist's finely tuned sensorium, Jung was surely imprinted by the dread and anxiety around as well as within him and his patients. The anticipation of impending external catastrophe and personal imagery is, from one perspective, to be expected. Yet when Jung's visions mirrored later events, the correspondence of the imagery across time was inexplicable. As I mentioned before, often a synchronicity is experienced as a post-diction. Often, even in the disciplines of discovery, when the inexplicable occurs, the temptation is toward denial or suppression. We remove ourselves from the paradoxes, from the riddles, from the surprises, and then they are neither explained by science or abandoned as nonsense by us. Rather than retreat into routine or rest on his laurels, Jung instead began a journal of his fantasies, the Red Book, an intimate personal passage through dread emotions. He did this in part as an attempt to understand the synchronicity. By taking this plunge, he used his individual psyche as an instrument of research into the not yet understood or scientifically explained convergence and meaningful coincidence. He summoned his inner figures and voices for internal dialogue. He entered an emotional desert, and there he cried out for his soul. This entry into this first shocking parallel brought Jung to his awesome engagement with Pauli of synchronicity, and he brought us to an awareness of the liminal phenomena we call the psyche. Thank you.
Thank you, Beverly. Definitely have time for questions, comments. Okay. Kimbrough asks, Beverly, what are your thoughts on syntonic countertransference within the context of synchronicity?
Well, Jung addressed that when he talks about inductions. He was the first one in the psychological field to use that phrase induction. And in the psychology of the transference, he talks about in the analyst allowing themselves to be induced, so to speak, which is a stupid way to put it because there's not really a choice. He talks about how it becomes a psychological, emotional, and actual physical and almost chemical experience that the analyst experiences through the induction. I'm not even going to get into that. But anyway, so I think what is now called syntonic countertransference is, if you read Jung and you read that word induction, you can sort of match it to what the phenomena is being described in that term.
We linked one step more to the unus mundus.
One step more to the unus mundus, yeah. Which is that ground of being that's shared as two sentient beings in a room, and certainly in more spaces than rooms. Yeah.
Okay. Is there any more comments. We'll give folks a minute or two to
Mhm.
pull that together.
I'm so particularly struck with Jung's notion, again, that he arrived at the end of his life, that the psyche doesn't predict the future, but it's working on the attitudes we need for the future. That's the whole teleological that Morgan spoke of. Yeah. 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 And of course, the body knows in some way what's coming. So it's sending up these images. Yeah.
Well, okay, here we go. Farzad is still with us.
Mm-hmm.
Beverley, how was your understanding of synchronicity changed over time?
Good question.
That's a good question. I think it includes the body much more. Farzad, you were in the synchronicity roundtable we did with the Helix Center, along with me, Joe Cambray, and Harold. And I don't think that at that time I had as much of a sense of the physical phenomenon, the participation of the body in synchronicity. And it was really first both the work on alchemical imagery and then the work on the embodied aspect and source of emotions, which Jung followed William James in pursuing, that I was so much aware of that aspect.
Okay. Well, this is from Irene Zenu. This is going to take a bit of listening here. Very enlightening and moving presentation. Thank you, Beverley. Question. Taking into consideration Pauli's attraction to the unifying principle as a means to compensate for and heal his own psychic fragmentation, can his resistance to the archetype of Eros, to the feeling function, or the drive for basic relatedness, which was manifesting both intersubjectively in his refusal to submit to the transference demand and in his exchanges with von Franz, but also in the intrasubjective denial of his own anima figure of the Chinese woman, foreseeing the impending conflict between his ego's inability to relinquish his fixation with the principle of symmetry amid advancing theory identifying the asymmetry of the weak force in the physics theory. Speak to how his virulent cancer might be perceived as a kind of synchronicity orchestrated from the imperatives of the self to make manifest Pauli's stymieing of his individual process.
No, I would never go into the idea that cancer is a psychological cause and effect. That was exactly the opposite of what I was talking about earlier. Also, von Franz was my first analyst, and I survived. And so if an analysis doesn't continue, it's always a field phenomenon. Now, I have to admit, I have a great crush on Pauli, so you have to, take what I say, cum grano salis, which von Franz would often say. But he really didn't resist all his material, because even though there's all of that, and I write about it in the preface to Atom and Archetype, the Jung-Pauli correspondence, even though he had a hard time taking the new idea of symmetry breaking in physics in initially. That dream of the Chinese woman who's circling down cellar stairs did amplify his idea of the spin as the fourth dimension. And I'm going to let Harold speak to that if it all makes any sense. If it doesn't make any sense, you don't have to speak to it. But he, every morning, Polly would wake up and write down his dreams, throw an I Ching, submit his mind and psyche to looking at himself through the perspective of the I Ching as a third perspective, even on the dyad between himself and consciously and his dream. That's dedication. He wrote down 1,400 of his dreams and he gave them to Jung. They became Psychology and Alchemy, the 400 dreams that Jung then took. So he really submitted himself to that incredible interactive, intersubjective process with his psyche. And he started off from behind when it came to Eros. His mother was a prostitute. No, his wife was a prostitute, right?
A dancer, let's say.
Yeah.
And she married a chemist, and then Polly said, if she wants a chemist, then I'm better out.
So I so admire that kind of dedication that he showed to psyche. And he initially started going on the curatorium of the C.G. Jung Institute. He didn't last too long because he found all the business aspect of it kind of boring. But he really gave himself to the Jungian model and perspective.
Okay, from Cynthia Strite, Beverley, you mentioned a reference to neuroscience research on emotions and where the body is brought back in. Can you name a particular piece of research that would be helpful to read? I think you might send us to some of your own publications there.
Well, the neuroscientist that I am very enlightened by, one is Rodolfo Linas, Linas, and he speaks of the endogenous images and says that we have images in our beings that our sense perceptions only sculpt and trellis. So I recommend Rodolfo Linas. He was the chief of neuropsychiatry and neurobiology at NYU, and he examined the interior brain cells, but he was Colombian from Bogota and a good friend of Marquez's. So he was also affected by that magical realism of Latin American literature and 100 Years of Solitude. So he goes in both directions, and he talks about emotion and leading into imagination, which is where Jung went, that emotion led to imagery. Another is Jaak Panksepp, Affective Neuroscience. And these emotions researchers, even though they're neuroscientists, when they get into describing emotion, they almost get poetic and archetypal. And that is certainly true in Jaak Panksepp's work. I was on a panel with him in Cambridge many years ago when, in fact, some of this work about a body came up for a conference called About a Body. And he very much, even though he quoted Jung a little bit, but he really was affected by the archetypal. A new favorite is, well, he's not a new favorite, but a more recent publication is Joseph Ledoux, The 400 Billion Year Old History. And in it, he describes how we start from sponges and fish and animals, and different parts of nature, and they're all in us. And that, I think, really very much reinforces our Jungian form of interpretation, where we take the images and dreams as each representing a knowledge that come from them. So the animal knowledge, the plant knowledge, even the sponge knowledge. So I would recommend Joseph Ledoux's book. It's a heavy lift in terms of the neuroscience, but he gets close to the unus mundus idea within the human being. And of course, Damasio sort of goes into that realm. But I once was at a conference with Damasio, and he was talking about his work on emotion. And I said, oh, it sounds like Jung. He said, Jung worked on emotion? I had no idea Jung worked on emotion. So there we go.
Go figure. We have a detail here. Can we have the spelling of the NYU neuro guy's name?
Yeah, Rodolfo, Rodolfo, Linas, Linas. I'll be talking about his work in the International Association of Jungian Psychology that's going to be in Buenos Aires in August. And I've got I know, I talked somewhat about his work in an article I called Imagination as Laboratory, which is in the JAP. You could get some there.
Okay, we've got a question here from Robert Bump. Could you elaborate more on your comment that synchronicity is what Jung brings to us as a tribe? Do you think that synchronistic experiences always have an emergent connection with the collective unconscious?
I'd like to go at that in a slightly tangential way, which is, it's so interesting to me that, I mean, of course, we work with our patients about trying to keep their dreams confidential until they've really incubated them and they've been impacted and imprinted by their own dreams. Synchronicities, everybody wants to tell somebody. So I think it just that in of itself suggests that there's some sense that when we hit a synchronicity, we're brought out of ourselves in some way. We feel more part of a whole network, as I said. And the first step is to reach out to another human being and tell the story. We want to tell the narratives of synchronicities. Mm-hmm. They seem to be more lean toward shared experience. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Farzad says, thanks for highlighting that key shift to embodiment.
Well, Farzad, in your work, you described how the physical presence of an observer actually impacts the observations of the experimenter, so that there's something there about incarnated presence that also shifts the field of the experiment. Yeah.
Friends and colleagues, we have more time. Oh, here we go. 14, I didn't catch. This is Irene. Oh, Irene had another question. My goodness. This is a continuation of that first question. Does eros, or the feeling function, play a part in the process of synchronicity? Can this be mapped out from a quantum physics perspective? Quite a double whammy there. And or are we to understand this as the impetus for psychic union that can be derived from the felt sense of an experience of internally conceived meaning that is externally perceived by becoming somatized in the body.
Well, I think that inner outer has been addressed this afternoon. And I'm trying to, there's other pieces, you know, you can just check some of what I've written and published for some of that. There's one called Emotion and Synchronicity. And in Harold's Pauli Jung conjecture volume, I wrote a chapter called Time and Tao and Synchronicity. So there's much more in those pieces that might be enlightening in terms of your questions.
Okay, folks. We do have some more time. People have comments or questions.
Well, we can also go into the panel.
Move directly into the panel.
Mhm.
Okay, well, thank you, Beverly. And it's been quite a series of presentations. Now we'll take a moment to organize ourselves into the panel. Okay, it looks like we're ready visually.
So we need Morgan and Dean.
Morgan,
most of all,
yes.
coming back.
Yes, Morgan and Dean.
I'm here for some reason. I've been visually excommunicated. Okay, here we go.
Yeah,
Welcome back
excommunicated, no.
on exile.
No, my video was turned off not by me.
And Dean is here.
Dean, are you with us?
But maybe that Dean has on his schedule
4:45.
4:45, so
Oh.
we should make a break in that case.
Okay, yeah. That's a little less than about 13 minutes from now.
Or would you say we just go ahead anyway?
Well, no, I think he stayed out to be with us, so I think we should,
Yeah, the least we can do is wait for him.
yeah, mannerly.
Um,
And if there are other questions, I can answer them, and Harold might have some.
We can call him and look him up.
I think there was one of the questions was about the symmetry breakdown with respect to parity.
Mhm,
That has nothing to do with spin,
mhm.
first of all. And then also,
Oh, yeah, that I knew, yeah.
and then the other point is that the asymmetry with respect to parity alone turned out not to be a problem for Pauli because we have CPT symmetry. So if you have the product of charge conjugation, parity conjugation, and time reversal, if you put all that together, then you have prosymmetry retained. That was for Pauli.
Mhm,
With Pauli, it's true that Pauli was sort of addicted to symmetries,
mhm, mhm.
as all mathematical physicists are essentially, because symmetries are such a powerful tool really to work with in physics and theoretical physics. You can predict new particles based on symmetries and many other things. So it would be sort of, it's true what Pauli felt that, you know, losing a symmetry would be a catastrophe.
Mhm.
So what you can do is when one symmetry is not retained, you can add another one to it, which also is usually not retained, and the product of both is retained again.
Uh-huh.
That's what CPT symmetry means.
Oh, so it comes back together.
Yeah.
It's like that dissociation
Yeah, in a way.
return.
In a way, yeah.
Good. And the alchemists were so incredible in terms of, in their language, how they described all of those oscillation of energy.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, Jung and Pauli talked about alchemy a lot too, right?
Mhm.
And I think they came to the conclusion that the historical period of alchemy in the 16th century, something like that, the high period of alchemy. Actually, in this period, alchemy attempted something like a representation of the mental with the physical, right?
Mhm.
But the knowledge ground from which they tried to do that was not solid enough to
Mhm.
achieve the goal. And then what Paul and Jung really speculated was whether in the middle of the 20th century, when they discussed all this, whether our knowledge basis has now developed far enough that we are mature enough for another attempt. And that would become the substance of the Paleo conjecture. Of course. So it's a long historical trajectory.
Mhm. Mhm. Ancient Egypt down.
Yes, yeah, and even if you go back that far,
Yeah, yeah.
exactly, yes,
Mhm.
that's right.
I mean, just to put a point on that, the wrappings of mummies were dipped in nitrous acid,
I don't know.
and the name for what we call gods were naders, that they were the carriers of preservative energies. And so it was, the wrappings were like wrapping the body in transcendent, eternal kind of energies with chemistry, actual dipping them into a substance and then wrapping. So it's there in 2700 BC.
Yeah, and Jung and Pauli would say this, of course, is the same kind of misplaced concreteness as the alchemists tried.
Mhm.
Right? It's a misplaced concreteness in the sense that, for instance, the alchemists projected their psyche into something that happens in the laboratory, and then they claimed that they would produce a stone of wisdom or whatever it was in this form. And so, Jung, of course, would say, no, this is the wrong way to go, because you should not project your psyche into the experiment. You should make your psyche part of the bigger experiment in which it is related to the material world. You see, so that's really progress, I think.
I think on the other hand, we still do that, right? Because as Jung says, anything that we don't understand but are concerned with draws our projections. So I think it's important to realize that we project into whatever the edge of our understanding is, just as much as the Egyptians did and just as much as the alchemists did. The hard thing is seeing where we do it now. Maybe let's say in the realm of politics or something, but there's always that edge of, we're in the dark as much as everyone was always in the dark. We just have a new place to do it in, and it's very hard to see it.
And maybe if we're lucky, some of the projections at least can be taken back.
Sure, that's the process. I think just for, not for all time. I think that
right.
Every generation has its new projections and then has its new job to do.
That's right.
Yeah, and in 1957, Jung wrote, 100 years from now, people will look back and wonder if we had the slightest idea of what we were talking about.
Right.
Probably not.
I think it's also why he was quite humble about the next generation, even of Jungians, bringing his work forward into the new manifestation of symbols.
Something from Sylvester.
We do, yeah. We've got two questions, actually. I apologize for not picking up on that sooner. Kimbrough asks, if possible, could you give an example of how you dealt with doubling symbols by separate analysans in your practice? How did you interpret that for yourself?
Of course, I mean, why was I the person there who was perceiving all of
Blackbirds.
Yeah, all of this. Of course, I went and worked on that. And Joe Cambray has a wonderful article about a patient. Enactments and Amplifications, I think it might be called, where he talks about how a patient had a dream of going into the Black Forest. I can't remember if the patient in the dream was or Joe. And so he went on a surfing trip the next day, and the first place that he surfed in was called the Black Forest. It was an under the surface of the sea, coral Black Forest.
Mhm.
And he talks about that in a very compelling way. Many years ago, Esther Harding, who was one of the big founders of the Jungian project in with her Way of All Women, feminist Jungian theory, started the Jung Institute here, started the Jung Foundation in New York. Every summer she would go to Bailey Island, where in fact Jung visited, and there would be a select group of her patients who went and each lived in their own little house and would just see her maybe once or twice a week. And at the end, she asked all their permission to give a seminar on the common image of the turtle that had appeared in all of their dreams. And so there's this wonderful seminar on the turtle, with that they all gave her permission to write about as individuals within a group, not as a group think. So I don't remember quite where she did that, but.
Beverly, I wonder if she took that at all personally, because I know in my practice, the first thing I do if I notice, especially a very particular image coming up more than once, is I wonder if there's something about myself that I'm not seeing, that somehow I'm participating in the field in a way that draws this image out, or there's something emergent about it in my own
Absolutely. Yes.
After that, we can wonder about some kind of emanation from the collective unconscious, but I think you need a bigger sample.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So, I don't make a big theoretical statement about, for instance, the blackbirds phenomena before September 11th that I noticed. But certainly, when I look back, there's sometimes when periods seem to be so full and perfect, there's a kind of dread of what is the opposite that's going to emerge. So it could very well reflect something that I was experiencing with some kind of dread about how long is this going to hold together. But it was very relevant at that time.
Well,
but I don't think it's fair to burden our patients with our synchronicities. They've got enough to deal with their own.
we do have one question from Sylvester here, Beverly, if I can try to do justice to it. He's wondering about the importance of interested community, that is scientists and Jungians, and the narratives produced by it need to be included as part of our understanding of dual aspect monism. It is this wider context of co-creation of theory that substantiates or coagulates individual ideas about how the unus mundus and its division function. Can you speak to the social collective construction of reality?
As we all go back to, I'm very fond of a statement Jung made in Memories and Dreams toward at the end. And he says, people ask me how I see so much. And he refers to a rabbi who said that he could only get a sense of the currents of the river by bending down. And so he refers to a kind of submission that he went through in terms of receiving all of this knowledge. And I've been to several of Harold's Science of Consciousness conferences, which brings in a great deal of the scientific imagery And you can't imagine how much bending down one has to do in order to take in all of that material, especially since my last class in science was when I was a college freshman and I cut up a frog. So it's been a long, tough stretch here. But I think, Sylvester, you're pointing to something that we do need. I mean, I try that we have to take in some of these scientific parallels, at least as a focus of exploration from the third perspective. And maybe we can do that more. We try to do it in our classes, and maybe we can just do it more. But this conference is very definitely today an attempt to create that. Now, I'll ask you more if this is really what you were interested in when we talk about it. But I just hope you see this conference as an attempt to bring different worlds together. I'm grateful to all the participants.
I mean, I think it's a little bit in the spirit of the Eranos, right? I mean, Jung really wanted to bring leaders of different fields in to educate him as well as cross-pollinate, because, you know, he writes in Ion that the psychological amplification or understanding is only one viewpoint. And, you know, the proverbial elephant needs a lot of viewpoints, and all of the sciences contribute to that, you know, and all of the arts. But, you know, I also, taking Sylvester's point about Abraxas before, my view is that human psychology is very, very ancient. And, you know, that some pundits like to think that it's something's new happening every generation or so. It doesn't seem like, in terms of the process of what we're trying to deal with, that it's new. That's just my reading of it. But, you know, other people have different viewpoints of it. It seems this is why we can look all the way back to a Lao Tzu or whomever and say, yep, I get that, or I don't, but I'm working on it. So
at these conferences, you also see some kind of inverse problem, because some of the scientists, some of the really narrow-minded scientists who do fantastic, wonderful work in this little sector, right? They are so full of themselves that they have never aspiration or no wish whatsoever to go to anything like a fuller picture, you know. And so there is not only education for philosophers by scientists, there should also be some kind of education for scientists by philosophy or even broader frameworks of thinking, which does sometimes work, not always.
Yeah, and that's where I admire so much in Pauli, that he opened himself up to that.
Opened himself up, partly,
Yeah.
that's right.
So I think that the question that Jung quotes in Memories, Dreams is, someone asked the rabbi how he still sees the face of God, and he says, I'm willing to stoop so low. You know, which talks about humanity and humility, which are from the same root word of from the ground, from the earth.
Okay. Well, we've moved into the time period of our discussion, certainly now.
Maybe Dean needs some rest now.
Yeah, he probably just fell. Yeah.
Could be. Okay. So then, Harold, I know you had some thoughts that you wanted to pick up on from earlier.
Yeah, that was an earlier question. I think it was a question to you, Morgan, about Rovelli's book on Helgoland. Was it for you? I think that was a question.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to interrupt at that time because there were other questions, you know, piling up. So that was the time would be best used for, you know, these questions. But I can maybe say a little more about what Carlo Rovelli tries to do for quantum mechanics, and how this might again be a kind of metaphor, a kind of pullback metaphor for the much bigger picture of the mind-body relation. I mean, Carlo Rovelli does not talk about the mind-body relation. He talks about quantum mechanics proper. And his approach that he himself called relational quantum mechanics is a kind of is a way to look at what usually how quantum mechanics is usually interpreted in a completely upside down way. He would say it's not upside down, it's downside up, because he thinks he has the right model, of course. So what Rovelli does is he talks about what physicists usually do, systems, particles, whatever it is. He would say this is not primary. We should look at the interactions between that which comes out at the end as particles or systems or whatever. The interactions should be considered the primary stuff. So interactions are always relational. That's why it's called relational quantum mechanics. Now in physics, we have exactly 4 fundamental interactions, not 3 and not 5. It's just 4. And these interactions, I don't go into those in detail, it doesn't matter. These interactions are usually represented as fields, right? So Rovelli would say these fields are the primary stuff in quantum mechanics, and particles or whatever other systems are somehow something like manifestations of these fields localized in space and time. So that's his picture, which is pretty radical already for physicists. But now it's still the narrow picture of physics within physics. Now, when you go to the big picture of the mind-body problem and look at it in terms of, for instance, dual aspect monism, then you have physics as only one part of the full story. And then you have the mental, and you have the psychophysically neutral when you are dual aspect monist. And then the question is, you can use Carlo's picture of a relational quantum mechanics and pull it into this new domain, in this much bigger domain. And then you come up with the following idea. You can say the relations between the physical, the mental, and the psychophysically neutral. This would be the primary stuff. These are fields. And the physical, the mental, and the psychophysically neutral are only manifestations in these fields. Like if you put an electron in an electromagnetic field, then it is a kind of probe particle which tells you something about the field. But the field is the primary stuff, right? And now then the next question would be, of course, in the big picture, the fundamental interactions of physics play no role whatsoever. They're in the physical part of it. But so the question is, what are these fields? What's going on there? It's not electromagnetism, of course. And the idea of Marcus Gabriel, with whom I'm now working on this idea, actually, his idea is these are sense fields, fields of sense, fields of meaning. And of course, there are infinitely many. There are not only 4, because you can relate everything with everything in terms of meaning, depending on what your ambitions are, what your intentions are, what your inclinations are, and so on. So this would be a very interesting field theory of meaning, literally, between the physical, the mental, and the psychophysically neutral. And this field theory would have to cover what I, this morning, called meaning as reference. Mm-hmm. It would have to cover meaning as sense. Mm-hmm. It would have to cover the symbolic explication of something that is then experienced as meaning. It would have to be a theory of synchronicity, of course. It would have to be a theory, when you go to Bohm, of active information that transforms implicate orders in explicate orders, and so on and so on. There are many other interesting points. So this is the bell that Rovelli, or the comment about Rovelli, mm-hmm. actually could ring. Mm-hmm. Right. So there's a really big picture, but this is totally incomplete work. And we're even not sure whether we can get anywhere with this, but I think it's a nice idea for years of work to come.
So we do, as Farzad suggests, add social and cultural fields to the many fields. Everything
is included. Yes,
fields are primary.
That's right. There's a nice book by Marcus Gabriel. He's a German philosopher. He's a rising star somehow. For a while, he was the youngest professor, not only in philosophy, the youngest professor at all in Germany. And that took several months. And then Peter Scholze came. who won the Fields Medal, and a mathematician. And Peter Scholze was only 24 when he got a professor, so he was the youngest, and also at Bonn, University of Bonn. No, but this is fantastic stuff. Yeah, and it for a start, it is completely right. If the theory is complete, it must also contain relationships or meaning fields in social and in cultural and in philosophical, whatever areas.
Yeah, and then in our domain, Jung's whole psychology of the transference is about every analysis being a different field. So
Yeah,
you're never this,
Yeah.
as an analyst, you're not the same with every person. You're quite different.
that's right. Yeah.
And so every analytic relationship is certainly a field.
And so the analyst and the analysand
Mhm.
are emanations of that field, literally.
Yeah. Mhm.
There. I mean, this is really what the field theory of Gabriel means.
We don't come first.
We don't come first.
We
No.
don't get first.
We'll come second. That's unbelievable.
We have a question asking for the young German philosopher's name. Can we spell that?
Gabriel. The second name is Gabriel, like the archangel. Gabriel.
Mm-hmm.
And Marcus is with a K.
Marcus is the first name with a K. Yeah, that's true.
You can see the discussion with Harold and him on the Helix website. What was that about? Numbers. It was about numbers.
Oh, I'm not sure.
Numbers.
What was it about? Something with math, because
Yeah, it was with math.
Harris,
Yeah.
Michael Harris was also
Yeah,
part of it.
yeah,
That had to do with math,
Yeah.
but I don't remember.
Yeah, because Helix brings together scholars from different fields to discuss a theme.
Mhm.
And there,
Mhm.
just check the Helix Center website and look for Harold's name, and you'll find the one he did with Gabriel.
Okay, more from Sylvester here. He says, I'm more thinking that we are somewhat creating a feedback loop in which we are focusing on the theory and not on the social aspects of narratives created around it.
Mhm.
For instance, we can see the compensation of ego attitudes in the psyche without Jung's theory of compensation. If the image within itself does not provide the direction of compensation, how the ego which engages it can be compensated if it does not have a notion of compensation. What directs compensation? Is it theory of compensation or image itself?
No, I think I'm a theoretician by, I don't know what, determination inherently. I don't know. I was always interested in theoretical questions because I'm addicted to insight. This is one of the second order drugs, if you want.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to understand. And then there are other people who apply the theory or don't apply it or whatever. That's I'm happy if people do this. If the theory that I have been helping developing helps them to understand things or predict things, this is not my business. Period.
So, there's another way to think about image too, which is as different points of view. So I think a lot of times in a very colloquial way, because I always like to think of things as simply and colloquially as possible, we could have different points of view about something within ourselves, and that we don't have to have a theory of compensation to think, should I do this? Should I not do this? Where would this go? I'm going to imagine that. You don't even have to have a theory of following an image. You wonder, you imagine, you let it in, it affects you, it changes you. And a lot of different parts have been seen in that moment.
Yeah.
So I think there's a very uncomplicated way to talk about a thing that happens very naturally.
Yeah, that's the
Right.
inductions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. Beverley, can you read your Woody Allen quote again? Because I have a more compact version of it, which I will give you when you read the
There is no question that there is an unseen world. The problem is how far it is from Midtown and how late it is open.
Okay, and here's Yogi Berra to the same topic. it gets late early out there in Tombstone, Arizona. You know Tombstone, the town too tough to die. It gets late early, so that's a nice way to put this, right? Because it is two different. These are late and earlier, of course. They both refer to time, to temporal instances.
Yeah.
So late is, of course, some kind of psychological experience because nobody is around anymore, so it feels late. But early is chronological time.
Yeah, right.
It's a nice mix of these two experiences, you know. It gets late early out there in whatever you want.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So space and time.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Prasad still going. Did one of you, and there's then one from Nilsson. Let's go with Nilsson. We'll have time to take them all, I think. When Jung postulated synchronicity, he then qualified it as a particular case of a more general case of acausal orderedness.
Mhm.
Do you see acausal orderedness as the permanent disentanglement that generates time itself, as if time creates its own narrative over itself? Through the generation of archetypal qualities in a constant variation of its spectra.
Joe Milton.
Who is that? No,
Milton.
do I know him?
Yes, you know.
No. So the first thing I think we have to distinguish is different understandings of time here. Time in physics is different from mental time. In physical time, we have no past, no future, and no present. So it's tenseless. The only thing we have in physical time is order relations like before or after. That's all. It's a very sparse kind of understanding of time. In mental time, in our mental experience, of course, we have past, the distinction of past and future, because facts are past and cannot be undone. The future is open and we can influence it somehow with our actions. And then between the past and the future, there is the present. Now, in mental time, the present is not just the infinitesimally small boundary between past and future, but the present always has extension, right? Bergson talked about this, Husserl talked about it, Whitehead talked about it. There are many philosophical accounts of this. Edelman also.
Yeah.
And so this is not the case in physics again. In physics, there is something either later or with something previous. Right? There's no physics has no nowness, so to speak. So now the question is, how long does this temporal present last? And of course, this is not universally fixed. Physicists would immediately ask for a universal present, but this is nonsense in the mental domain. In the mental domain, it can be small, it can be large, it can be many things. So, and then with this kind of distinction, we should go into that question again. And can you still repeat the part?
The second part, maybe?
Yeah, maybe the second
Or,
part.
Do we see acausal orderedness as the
Yeah.
permanent disentanglement that generates
Yes,
time
okay.
itself?
Exactly. That now I understand why I said what I said before. So the acausal ordering is actually a kind of contradiction in itself, because when you're in the present, the mental present, right? Then within that present, there are no time slices in there. There's no fragmentation. It's one whole. It's exactly the same as entanglement in quantum mechanics, where you talk about one whole, which is not separated into local pieces. It's one whole. And here you have the notion of locality on the time arrow, if you want. There's one whole in which there are no parts. And in that one whole, there are, of course, if you have no parts that are previous or later, then of course there's also no causation. Because if you have a causal relation, then you want to relate something that is that is a cause in the past, which causes an effect in the future. But if future and past are not existent in the present, then it's meaningless to talk about a causal relation. So it's acausal, exactly in that sense.
Well, in a 1952 letter, Jung wrote, when we speak of psyche, we have to give up the notions of space and time altogether because the psyche is an unextended intensity. So
I would say in the what we normally call the conscious psyche, of course we have mental time.
sure.
We don't have space,
Mhm,
but not the usual space at
Mhm.
least. But when we go to the unconscious,
mhm.
the deeper we go, the less we are
Yes.
entitled. It becomes
Exactly.
illegitimate to talk about
Exactly.
time and space.
Right.
And Dean this morning talked about Wheeler's notion of pre-geometry,
Mhm,
or David Bohm's notion of pre-space-time. These are all concepts with which now the physicists try to describe a domain of reality. I mean, the psychophysically neutral again, in which time and space are not existent in the sense that we use them in physics and in the mental domain. And it's all very consistent, but also with Jung says.
Well, and I think we can relate that to many generations of religious writing, which talks about, almost all living beings are without time, without space, without causality,
Exactly.
merely with intensity.
Whatever that is, yes. But Spinoza is a perfect example. Spinoza is a perfect example. He has all this on the table already.
Right.
Yeah, it's fun. It's so fantastic.
Barzad writes, he's rephrasing his earlier question to Dean. In the context of quantum wholeness, specifically Wheeler's perspective, is light purely chronological and causal, and chaos timeless? Is there a relationship between the two?
I mean, we have to say what we mean by light. If light is understood in a physical sense, then of course it is treated like any other physical system. And I think what Farsad may have in mind is that light travels in vacuum, travels with the velocity of light. So it forms the boundary of a light cone in general relativity, which means that it's just on the border between space-like and time-like events. In that sense, you could say light doesn't experience time, but of course, light doesn't experience anything because it doesn't have experiential, potential in physics. It has nothing like that. Then you could, of course, say light could also be a kind of mental image when it has nothing to do with physics at all. And the third meaning of light could be as a symbolic description of something at the archetypal level. Then, of course, it's also not physics, but then it can become the experience of light. I mean, we all know, Morgan, you will know that particularly well. Light experiences in meditation, for instance, are often literally called enlightenment. So this is exactly what it is all about. And these experiences can be extremely transformative, but they also have nothing to do with physics. Yet these experiences may go along with an experience of timelessness, of an extremely extended present, temporal present, over hours maybe, or maybe even longer, some people report. So there is some relationship between these light experiences and an extended present, but that's, again, not the physical present, because the physical present does simply not exist.
It also reminds me that in 1911, Jung wrote to Freud and said that he had been having a series of dinners with a young physicist to talk about the theory of light and the kind of energy field around that. And that was with Albert Einstein. And 6 months later, Jung ended his relationship with Freud because he couldn't go along anymore in saying that all energy was sexual. And there was no question that those conversations about the theory of light with Albert Einstein was a major catalyst in that.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
You bring to mind David Rosen's work with people who experience near death in the context of jumping or almost jumping off the San Francisco Bay Bridge.
Mhm.
And many of them involved, this kind of light experience. Transforming Depression was his book. He doesn't get into the
Yeah.
physics of it, but it's a fascinating book.
Yeah.
Probably it's good that he doesn't get into physics, because physics would probably say we don't have anything to say about it.
But speaking of that back to the diagram you had, Harold, of one of the lines was a near-death experience. I don't know if anyone's seen the article on, they did a study of all the people that survived the jump from the Golden Gate Bridge, and only something like 7% survived, but 100% had a completely spiritual transformation afterwards.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So there, that's a rough way to get there, but
Yeah.
Farzad had another question about paradoxes.
I'm
Sorry, go
sorry.
ahead.
I just want to say, so you get the enlightenment experience with 7% probability. Maybe there are more productive ways to get there. I'm not sure.
Right, if we're looking at the odds, that's probably not the best one. Although it's probably higher than the people that get to meditating.
Okay. For those who survive.
Well, that's that. The downside is
Yeah.
harsher though.
That's right. Yeah. No, but I didn't want to interrupt you, Morgan.
No, I was just looking at one of Farzad had another question about paradoxes that spring up around synchronicity. And what I said was just quoting Jung from Mysterium, which was that paradoxes cluster around the arcane substance.
Yeah.
But the arcane substance is related to synchronicity, but it's psychologically speaking, it's that core thing where it's you could think of it as the core of a complex or archetype, which is timeless and spaceless and patterned. So that in that way, it's synchronous.
Yeah.
But it's when it begins to be seen as something prospective.
I think that when you really go down in this psychophysical neutral domain and approach the unus mundus or whatever, then not only time and space dissolve, also our usual everyday logic dissolves. We see this already in dreams. I mean, in dreams we cannot talk about Boolean logic or something in terms of the tertium non datur. This is all not valid anymore. And these terms, Nicholas of Cusa called it the coincidence of opposites, or Plotinus calls it the union of opposites. In all these Neoplatonist approaches, the notion of paradox is key when you try to explore this domain, which goes beyond the distinction between the mental and the physical.
That's true. And Jung's point too is that just because it's a paradox doesn't mean you can't talk about it. It means actually a paradox is a good description of it, and you need to take both sides of the paradox very seriously. So it's not that he's punting or something. It's that he's saying this is how you can tell when you're onto it.
It just violates our everyday logic. But what does that mean? This is not very. I mean, who says that this is the universally valid logic?
Right.
We once did. We had the Jung's Red Book first exhibited at the Rubin Museum.
Mhm.
And then a couple of years later, we did an art and psyche program. And part of it was that 13 of our analysts went over for a dream over at the Rubin Museum. And we had a Tibetan dream guide. And then, we're awakened ourselves at 4 a.m., had to awaken these people we were assigned to at 5 a.m. And the most fascinating part of that in terms of time was that when people told their dreams just waking up, and I mean, that's not usually when we're with our patients, right? That they told that we wrote them down the next morning. That morning we had our group with the people that we had taken the dreams from, and they retold the dreams to the group. The content of the dreams was exactly the same. The sequence of time was reversed. So in the
Or not even
waking up,
recognizable.
but what was noticeable
Okay,
then
it was reverse billing. Okay.
was that, oh, this happened. Oh, before that, this happened. Before that, this happened. And by the next day, their minds had made order of it chronologically.
exactly,
Yeah, logically.
That's the.
But that wasn't the dream time.
No, exactly. Yeah. I mean, experienced dreamers actually know when they wake up and are asked to report the dream that they cannot really put it into a temporal sequence.
Yes, right.
Of course, it's a normal reaction because our ordinary life happens like that. It's a sequence. So they project this kind of momentum onto the report of their dream. But then at some point you see when you really go into the details, it doesn't work. Right?
Yeah, it doesn't. Well, we have a couple of comments coming in here, but we're at our time. Sylvester refers, Tamar said, mentions Sherry Solomon's dreams of totality and the social implications of not looking at the compensatory function of images for society as a whole, resulting in our ignorance, that is, resulting in tribalism, fascism, and conspiracy theories.
Mhm. Yeah.
And well, Farzad's going to be working on paradoxical AI. So we look forward to hearing about that.
I would just like to mention two other neuroscientists. One is Gerald Edelman, Bright Air, Brilliant Fire, and he terms consciousness the remembered present, which I think is an incredible encapsulation of the psyche, is reflective, experiencing, remembering at the same time. And the other is Ian McGilchrist with The Master and His Emissary, about left and right hemisphere interactions. So thank you.
Well, okay, thank you, Beverly, and thanks to all our presenters and panelists, and to all those who gave us our thought-provoking questions. It's been a very, very rich day, and we may feel like we're just getting going here, but it's also been a long day. So it's been my pleasure to host this fascinating conference, and I look forward to speaking to you all again about synchronicity and related topics.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
Thanks,
you
Harold.
all.
Thanks, Harold. Thanks,
Hi,
Beverly.
Morgan. Next time
Thank
you'll
you.
be here in New York, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Was that yours?